Everyone assumes that effective weapons follow simple geometric rules. A sword needs a straight edge, an axe needs weight behind a single blade, a spear needs a pointed tip driving forward. This logic feels obvious because it dominates every medieval arsenal from London to Constantinople. When European explorers first encountered African throwing blades in the 19th century, they saw curved, multi-pronged iron shapes that violated every principle of weapon design they understood. The blades branched in multiple directions. They had no clear cutting edge. They looked decorative, ceremonial, impractical. Collectors placed them in museums as primitive curiosities. Military historians dismissed them as ineffective against real armor or trained fighters. But medieval combat didn't work that way. The weapon we're discussing belongs to a family of African throwing blades developed across Central Africa, particularly among the Azande and Mangbetu peoples. Europeans called them throwing knives, but that name misses the point entirely. These weren't knives. They were airborne trauma engines. A typical Kpinga measures 18 to 24 inches across its widest span. It weighs between 1 and 2 pounds. The iron is forged with multiple curved blades projecting from a central grip, usually 3 to 5 distinct cutting surfaces, each angled differently. Some curve forward like sickles, others sweep backward. The overall shape resembles nothing in European experience. Here's what matters. These weapons weren't designed to stick into targets like arrows or spears. They were designed to tumble through the air and make contact with any surface they encountered during rotation. In open terrain warfare across African savannas and forest edges, where formations were loose and mobility was survival, fighters needed weapons that could strike fleeing enemies, disable warriors at medium range, and create injury from unpredictable angles. A throwing blade spinning through space at 30 miles per hour doesn't need to hit point first, it just needs to hit. Picture the throw itself. The fighter grips the weapon by its wrapped handle. The throwing motion resembles a sidearm cast, not an overhand spear throw. The blade leaves the hand spinning horizontally, rotating around its center of mass. Because the blades project in multiple directions, the weapon is never more than a half rotation away from a cutting surface facing the target. This is the first mechanical advantage European observers missed. As the blade spins through air, it maintains rotational momentum. When it contacts flesh, whichever blade surface strikes first acts as the primary wound channel. But here's where the geometry becomes devastating. The impact doesn't stop the rotation completely. The blade's angular momentum carries through the initial cut, and secondary blades continue their arc into the target area. What this means in practice, a single impact creates multiple wound trajectories. One blade might slice across the upper arm. The rotational follow-through brings a second blade into the shoulder. A third might hook behind the limb as the weapon completes its spin. Now consider what happens to tissue and bone. The curved blades don't create clean puncture wounds like arrows. They create slicing trauma across broad surface areas. A blade curving forward generates cutting force perpendicular to its travel. The iron edge contacts skin, parts it, and the blade's curve forces the cut to widen as momentum carries the weapon through its rotation. If the blade strikes an extended limb, an arm raised to throw a spear, a leg in mid-stride, the impact doesn't just cut, it creates rotational force against the joint itself. This is where limbs start falling. The human arm connects to the shoulder through muscle, tendon, and ligament, strong in normal use, but vulnerable to perpendicular force. A heavy blade moving 30 miles per hour, spinning as it strikes, delivers force in multiple directions simultaneously. The initial impact cuts through skin and surface muscle. The rotation brings secondary blades through deeper tissue. The weapon's mass and momentum, distributed across multiple blade surfaces, creates shearing force against the joint structures that normally keep limbs attached. European physicians examining wounds inflicted by these weapons reported complete or near-complete limb separation from what appeared to be primitive iron blades thrown by hand. The sound of impact tells part of the story. Metal striking flesh creates a wet, heavy thud, not the sharp crack of an arrow hitting armor. The rotation adds a tearing quality as secondary blades follow through, something between a slash and a wrench. Think about what this means for the fighter on the receiving end. You're pursuing an enemy. You're 40 feet behind him. The weapon leaves his hand spinning. You don't track it clearly because it's tumbling horizontally, difficult to follow. The impact comes from an angle you didn't anticipate. One blade hooks your extended arm, another catches your shoulder. The rotational force yanks your limb backward against its natural range of motion. In half a second, you've lost structural integrity in your primary weapon arm. You're bleeding from multiple wound channels. You're no longer combat effective. If you're enjoying cutting through medieval myths like this, consider subscribing. Arms and Impact breaks down how weapons and armor actually worked, beyond the movies and into real combat. The multiplane design creates another effect European observers initially missed. The weapon is nearly impossible to block with a shield in the traditional sense. A shield deflects linear threats, arrows, spears, straight sword cuts. But a tumbling blade with projections in multiple directions doesn't deflect cleanly. One blade might contact the shield surface, but secondary blades continue their rotation around the edge. A blade curving backward can hook the shield's rim and continue into the defender's arm or shoulder. The geometry that looked chaotic and inefficient was actually solving a specific problem: how to create injury despite defensive tools. What this forced African warriors to develop was tactical doctrine around rotational projectiles. Throwing blades weren't used in isolation. They were integrated into combined arms systems that European military observers fundamentally misunderstood. Fighters carried multiple throwing blades along with close combat weapons, spears, swords, or clubs. The throwing blade's role was to disrupt, disable, or demoralize enemies at ranges beyond spear-throwing distance, but closer than archery range. The real tactical innovation wasn't the weapon itself. It was the targeting doctrine. Experienced throwers aimed for extended limbs, not center mass. An enemy raising a spear to throw becomes vulnerable. An enemy running with arms pumping in stride presents multiple impact opportunities. The curved blade geometry meant that precision wasn't necessary. Contact anywhere along an extended limb could generate disabling trauma because the rotation would distribute cutting force across multiple surfaces. This forced European colonial forces encountering these weapons to adapt their own tactics. Early expeditions assumed that body armor and tight formations would neutralize primitive throwing weapons. They learned otherwise. The multi-blade geometry and rotational mechanics made traditional shield walls less effective. By the late 19th century, European military manuals discussing African warfare began including specific sections on throwing blade tactics, not as curiosities, but as legitimate tactical problems requiring doctrinal solutions. Return to those museum displays where collectors placed throwing blades as decorative artifacts. The myth persists today because the weapons look exotic and geometrically chaotic. They don't conform to Western expectations of what an effective weapon should look like. But effectiveness in combat isn't about aesthetic conformity. It's about solving specific tactical problems with available materials and manufacturing techniques. The historical truth is this: African throwing blades represented sophisticated engineering solutions to open terrain warfare. The multiplane blade geometry wasn't primitive, it was specialized. The curved surfaces weren't decorative, they were functional trauma generators. The rotational mechanics weren't accidental, they were the entire design purpose. When European observers called these weapons impractical, they revealed their own limited understanding of how different combat environments demand different weapon geometries. Why does understanding this matter now? Because it dismantles a persistent assumption that European weapon designs represented the pinnacle of medieval martial technology. Effective weapons emerge from specific tactical needs, not universal design principles. The African warriors who developed, refined, and deployed throwing blades understood rotational mechanics and wounding theory in ways that European military tradition simply hadn't explored. Arms and Impact exists to examine these gaps between popular assumptions and historical reality. The throwing blade isn't unique in being misunderstood. It's just particularly dramatic in how the myth of primitiveness collapsed the moment limbs started falling. What weapon or myth should we break next? Comment below.